The altimeter needle climbed past 30,000 feet, and Captain Edmund Larsen watched the thin air outside his pressurized cockpit turn from pale blue to deep indigo. Below, somewhere in that vast emptiness over the Pacific, Japanese fighters circled like frustrated sharks, their engines straining and choking in air too thin to sustain combustion. It was March 15th, 1944, and Larsen was about to prove something that would reshape the entire strategic bombing campaign against Japan, that the B-29 Superfortress could fly so high that enemy interceptors simply could not follow. The aircraft shuddered slightly as it pushed through 30,500 feet. Larsen's breath came easy thanks to the pressurized cabin, a luxury no other bomber crew in the war possessed. Outside, he knew, the temperature had plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The air pressure had dropped to barely 4 pounds per square inch, less than a third of what it was at sea level. For a man without oxygen, consciousness would last perhaps 15 seconds at this altitude. For a piston engine without a supercharger powerful enough to force air into its cylinders, the result was the same: gasping, dying, falling from the sky. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This wasn't supposed to be a combat mission. This was a test, one that many at Boeing and in the Army Air Forces had privately called suicidal. The B-29 was the most expensive weapons program in American history, costing nearly $3 billion, more than the Manhattan Project itself. It was also the most complex aircraft ever built, with more than 55,000 individual parts, pressurized crew compartments connected by a tunnel barely wide enough for a man to crawl through, and 4 Wright R-3350 engines that had an alarming tendency to catch fire. Pilots had died testing this aircraft. Crews had burned alive when engine fires spread to fuel tanks. And now Larsen was taking one to altitudes that would have been unthinkable for any other bomber in the war, deliberately exposing himself to enemy fighters to see if the theorists were right. Could Japanese interceptors reach them up here, or were they safe in this thin, frozen stratosphere? The answer to that question would determine whether the strategic bombing campaign against Japan's home islands was even possible. Without altitude superiority, B-29s would be vulnerable to the same fate that had plagued British bombers over Germany in the early years of the war. Catastrophic losses, mission after mission, until the offensive ground to a halt. With it, they could rain destruction on Japanese industry from a height where interceptors were impotent, where anti-aircraft fire lost effectiveness, where the bomber truly reigned supreme. But first, someone had to fly up there and find out. The concept behind the B-29 had emerged from a brutal lesson learned over Europe. In 1940 and 1941, the Royal Air Force had attempted daylight precision bombing raids on German targets, sending unescorted bombers deep into hostile airspace, in the belief that tight formations and defensive firepower would be sufficient protection. The Germans had proved them catastrophically wrong. Bf-109s and FW-190s had torn through British formations, sending bombers tumbling from the sky in flames. The RAF had switched to night bombing, sacrificing accuracy for survival. The Americans, arriving later with their B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, had insisted they could succeed where the British had failed, relying on heavily armed bombers in tight formation. They too had suffered appalling losses until long-range escort fighters finally arrived to protect them. The Pacific War presented different challenges. Japan's industrial heartland lay thousands of miles from any captured Allied airbase, separated by vast expanses of ocean. To reach Japanese cities from China required flying over the Himalayas, the most dangerous air route in the world, where hundreds of transport aircraft had already vanished into mountain peaks and ice storms. From India, the distance was even more prohibitive, and Japanese air defenses, while less sophisticated than Germany's, were defended by pilots who had spent years perfecting their craft over China and Southeast Asia, flying aircraft specifically designed for high-altitude interception. The solution, American planners believed, lay not in trying to fight through Japanese defenses at medium altitude, but in flying so high that Japanese fighters simply could not reach them. This required an aircraft that didn't yet exist when the specifications were drawn up, a bomber with intercontinental range, capable of carrying a meaningful bomb load at altitudes above 30,000 feet, with pressurized crew compartments, so the men inside could function normally, while the air outside grew too thin to breathe. Boeing's engineers had worked near miracles to create such an aircraft. The B-29 was enormous, with a wingspan of 141 feet and a length of 99 feet, larger than any previous American bomber. Its four Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines each produced 2,200 horsepower, driving enormous three-bladed propellers. But size and power alone weren't enough. To achieve the required altitude, every ounce of the aircraft had to be optimized. The fuselage was a smooth, streamlined tube with an exceptionally high fineness ratio. The wings were long and thin, designed for efficiency in thin air. Even the remote-controlled gun turrets were aerodynamically refined, their teardrop shapes adding minimal drag. The pressurization system was perhaps the most revolutionary feature. Previous bombers required crews to wear bulky oxygen masks and heated suits, limiting their effectiveness in combat. The B-29's forward and rear crew compartments were pressurized to the equivalent of 8,000 feet, even when the aircraft flew at 30,000 feet or higher. A cylindrical tunnel, 34 inches in diameter, connected the two compartments, allowing crew members to crawl between them without depressurizing the entire aircraft. It was an engineering achievement without precedent in aviation, and it was also terrifyingly fragile. A single 20-millimeter cannon shell through the pressurized hull could explosively decompress the compartment, rendering the crew unconscious in seconds. But would Japanese fighters even get close enough to fire that shell? Japanese aircraft designers had approached the problem of high-altitude flight from a different philosophical direction. Where American engineers had accepted weight and complexity in pursuit of survivability and performance, Japanese designers had ruthlessly minimized weight to maximize range and maneuverability. The Mitsubishi A6M-0, perhaps the most famous Japanese fighter, could outclimb and outturn nearly any American fighter at low to medium altitudes. It achieved this through radical weight reduction. Thin aluminum skin, no armor protection for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks, minimal armament compared to American fighters. The Zero could reach an altitude of 33,000 feet on paper, but theoretical ceiling and combat ceiling were vastly different things. An aircraft's service ceiling was defined as the altitude at which its rate of climb dropped to just 100 feet per minute. At that height, the aircraft was barely controllable, mushing through air so thin that control surfaces lost effectiveness. The engine struggled to produce enough power to sustain flight. Any combat maneuvers, violent turns, climbs to pursue a target, could stall the aircraft and send it tumbling from the sky. And reaching service ceiling took time, precious time during which a bomber formation could pass overhead and continue toward its target. The Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki, known to the Allies by the code name Tojo, was specifically designed for high-altitude interception. It had a service ceiling of 36,900 feet, theoretically sufficient to engage B-29s. But it achieved this through a powerful engine crammed into a small, stubby airframe, sacrificing range and endurance. More critically, the Ki-44's rate of climb fell off dramatically above 25,000 feet. Reaching 30,000 feet required nearly 20 minutes of climb time from sea level, and by the time the fighter arrived at that altitude, it was nearly out of fuel and unable to sustain combat. The Americans had studied Japanese fighter performance extensively through intelligence reports, captured aircraft, and combat experience. They knew the theoretical capabilities of Japanese interceptors. What they didn't know with certainty was whether those capabilities would translate to effective combat at extreme altitude. Could a Zero or a Ki-44, straining at the edge of its performance envelope, still shoot down a B-29? Could Japanese pilots, trained primarily for combat at medium altitudes, effectively engage targets in the stratosphere, where oxygen deprivation and extreme cold turned every movement into a struggle? And could Japanese air defense networks even detect and vector fighters to intercept bombers at those altitudes? The test flight Larsen was conducting was designed to answer these questions. The B-29 would fly a deliberate, predictable course over known Japanese-controlled territory at maximum altitude. Japanese radar would detect it. Fighters would scramble to intercept. And the B-29 crew would observe, photograph, and document exactly what happened when Japanese interceptors tried to reach them. It was, in essence, using a $3 billion aircraft and 11 highly trained crew members as bait. Larsen leveled off at 31,000 feet. The 4 right engines hummed steadily, their turbo superchargers forcing air into the cylinders at sufficient pressure to maintain power. Below, through scattered clouds, he could see the dark blue of the Pacific and, in the distance, the green smudge of land, Japanese-occupied territory. His navigator, Lieutenant James Walsh, had plotted a course that would take them within 50 miles of a known Japanese airfield, close enough to guarantee detection, far enough to give them time to evade if something went wrong. "Radio operator reports Japanese transmissions," Walsh called over the intercom. "Looks like they've spotted us." Larsen acknowledged. Now came the waiting. Would fighters appear? How high could they climb? And most critically, could they reach the B-29's altitude with enough fuel and performance remaining to pose a threat? The bombardier, Lieutenant Robert Chen, was in the nose with a camera, tasked with photographing any interceptors that appeared. In the tail gunner position, Staff Sergeant Thomas Murphy watched the sky behind them, calling out when he spotted the first fighter. "Interceptor, 5 o'clock low, approximately 5,000 feet below us." Larsen craned his neck. There, a tiny speck against the clouds, climbing in a slow, laborious spiral. Even from this distance, he could see it was struggling. The fighter's rate of climb had slowed to a crawl. It would level off, try to gain speed, then resume climbing, each gain measured in hundreds of feet rather than thousands. "He's trying," Murphy observed, "but he's not getting here." A second fighter appeared, then a third. All 3 climbed desperately, trying to reach the B-29's altitude. One made it to approximately 29,000 feet before its engine began to cough and sputter, starved for oxygen. It leveled off, circled once, then dove away, unable to climb higher. The other 2 reached similar altitudes and met the same fate. None came within effective firing range. Larsen maintained course and speed, giving the Japanese fighters every opportunity to intercept. For 15 minutes, the B-29 flew straight and level, a perfect target if the fighters could reach it. They couldn't. "Chen, are you getting good photographs?" Larsen asked. "Yes, sir. Clear shots of all 3 interceptors at maximum altitude. The film will show exactly how far below us they topped out." This was the moment of revelation, the collision between theory and reality. On paper, Japanese fighters could reach 33,000 feet or higher. In practice, laden with ammunition and fuel, operating in actual combat conditions rather than controlled test flights, they topped out several thousand feet lower. And those final 1,000 feet made all the difference. At 31,000 feet, the B-29 was untouchable. Shall I continue with part 2 of the script? The implications became clear immediately upon Larsen's return to base. The photographs Chen had taken showed Japanese fighters at their maximum altitude, clearly visible thousands of feet below the B-29's flight path. The data was irrefutable. At combat weight,
With full ammunition and sufficient fuel for interception operations, Japanese fighters could not effectively engage B-29s flying above 30,000 feet. The theoretical ceiling meant nothing when translated to actual combat conditions, but one successful test flight was not enough to base an entire strategic campaign upon. The Army Air Forces needed more data, more proof that this altitude advantage was consistent across different conditions, different fighters, and different tactical situations. Over the following weeks, additional test flights were conducted, each designed to probe a different aspect of Japanese air defense capabilities. On March 23, 1944, another B-29 flew a similar profile, this time at 32,000 feet. Japanese fighters scrambled again, and again they failed to reach interception altitude. On April 2nd, a test flight deliberately slowed to reduce altitude advantage, descending to 29,000 feet to see if Japanese fighters could exploit the lower altitude. They came closer. One Ki-44 managed to close to within 1,500 feet, but could not sustain combat maneuvering at that altitude. The pilot made one firing pass, his guns blazing, but the thin air robbed his aircraft of maneuverability. The bullets fell short, and the fighter stalled, dropping away in a spin before the pilot recovered at lower altitude. These test flights revealed something Japanese military planners had known but desperately hoped to conceal. Their air defense network had a ceiling it could not penetrate. Japanese engineers understood the problem perfectly. They had designed fighters capable of high-altitude performance, but physics and engineering limitations constrained what was possible with available technology. The Ki-44's Nakajima Ha-109 engine produced maximum power at low
altitude but lost effectiveness rapidly as air density decreased. Superchargers helped, but they added weight and complexity, and even the best superchargers couldn't completely compensate for the exponential decrease in air density at extreme altitudes. More fundamentally, Japanese aircraft design philosophy had prioritized different performance characteristics. The Zero's legendary maneuverability came at the cost of weight that might have been used for more powerful engines, better superchargers, or stronger airframes capable of handling the stress of high-altitude flight. This wasn't a failure of Japanese engineering. It was a conscious choice based on the tactical realities they had faced in China and Southeast Asia, where air combat typically occurred below 20,000 feet. They had optimized their aircraft for the war they were fighting, not the war that was coming. The Americans, by contrast, had the luxury of learning from European experience and the industrial capacity to pursue multiple, expensive solutions simultaneously. The B-29 program alone employed thousands of engineers and tens of thousands of workers. Boeing's production facilities in Wichita, Kansas were among the largest aircraft factories in the world, covering over 160 acres. The company had invested in specialized tooling, training programs, and quality control procedures that had no equivalent in Japanese industry. Where Japanese factories struggled to produce 50 to 60 fighters per month, American facilities were beginning to produce B-29s at a rate approaching 100 per month by mid-1944. This industrial disparity manifested in every aspect of the B-29's design. The pressurization system alone required precision manufacturing tolerances that few factories in the world could achieve. The rubber seals around hatches and windows had to be perfect. Any leak would compromise cabin pressure. The structural integrity of the pressurized hull had to withstand repeated cycles of pressurization and depressurization without developing stress fractures. The Wright R-3350 engines, despite their troublesome reliability record, represented the cutting edge of piston engine design, incorporating technologies that Japanese engineers could only dream of replicating. Japanese intelligence had obtained information about the B-29 program as early as 1943 through various channels. Agents in neutral countries had collected technical specifications from American aviation publications, which freely published details that would have been classified in Japan. Captured documents from China included references to a new long-range bomber. Japanese military attachés in Switzerland and Sweden had pieced together information from multiple sources. By early 1944, Japanese planners knew that B-29s were coming and that they would fly higher and farther than any previous American bomber. What they couldn't know, until those test flights in March and April of 1944, was whether their existing fighters could counter the threat. The test flights provided the answer, and it was devastating. They could not. The Japanese Army Air Force and Naval Air Service immediately began crash programs to develop effective high-altitude interceptors. The Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien, a fighter powered by a liquid-cooled engine similar to German designs, was modified with improved superchargers. The Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, introduced in mid-1944, incorporated more powerful engines and better high-altitude performance. But these improvements were incremental, and they came too late. By the time improved Japanese fighters entered service in meaningful numbers, B-29s were already conducting regular bombing missions against Japanese targets. The first operational B-29 raid against Japan proper occurred on June 15, 1944, when 68 superfortresses attacked steelworks at Yawata on Kyushu Island, flying from bases in China. The bombers flew at altitudes between 25,000 and 32,000 feet. Japanese fighters intercepted, and 7 B-29s were lost. But most losses came from mechanical failures and accidents rather than enemy action. Japanese fighters that managed to reach bombing altitude found themselves at the extreme edge of their performance envelope, unable to execute effective attacks. One pilot, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most experienced fighter aces, later described the frustration of pursuing B-29s at altitude. We climbed, and still they were above us. When we finally reached their level, we had no speed, no maneuverability. We could fire our guns, but hitting a target required sustained fire, and we could not sustain anything at that altitude. The disparity became even more apparent when the 20th Air Force began operating from the Mariana Islands in late 1944. The capture of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam provided bases just 1,500 miles from Tokyo, close enough that B-29s could reach Japanese cities carrying maximum bomb loads. The first raid from the Marianas occurred on November 24, 1944, when 111 B-29s attacked Tokyo's Nakajima aircraft factory. They flew at altitudes above 30,000 feet, and Japanese fighters were virtually helpless. Of the 111 bombers that reached the target, only 2 were lost to all causes. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. From the Japanese perspective, the realization was crushing. Pilots who had dominated Asian skies for years, who had achieved air superiority over China and Southeast Asia through skill and superior equipment, now found themselves fighting a battle they could not win. The psychological impact was profound. Major Yoshio Yoshioka, a fighter pilot stationed at Naramasu Airfield near Tokyo, kept a diary throughout the war. His entries from late 1944 reveal the mounting desperation. November 26th, another formation of B-29s passed overhead today. We scrambled 8 fighters. We climbed for 20 minutes. By the time we reached 28,000 feet, they were already over the target and turning for home. We could see them clearly, hear the thunder of their engines, but we could not touch them. It is like fighting ghosts. The technological gap extended beyond altitude performance. B-29s carried sophisticated radar systems that allowed them to navigate accurately in darkness and through cloud cover. Japanese fighters, lacking radar themselves, relied on visual sighting and ground-based radar guidance. When B-29s began conducting night raids in early 1945, Japanese air defenses became even less effective. Night fighters could sometimes find B-29s through searchlight illumination, but engaging them at altitude and darkness was nearly impossible. Japanese anti-aircraft artillery faced similar limitations. The most common heavy anti-aircraft gun in Japanese service was the Type 88 75mm gun, which had an effective ceiling of approximately 26,000 feet. Some Type 3 120mm guns could engage targets up to 30,000 feet, but fire control systems struggled to track aircraft at such altitudes, and the number of these heavy guns was limited. When B-29s flew above 30,000 feet, they were effectively beyond the reach of most Japanese flak batteries. The Japanese attempted various countermeasures. Ramming attacks were authorized, with pilots instructed to deliberately crash their fighters into B-29s if they couldn't shoot them down. On several occasions, Japanese pilots attempted this desperate tactic, but the relative speeds and altitudes involved made successful ramming attacks extremely difficult. The fighter had to close to within a few feet of the bomber while both aircraft were traveling at several hundred miles per hour, at an altitude where the slightest error could stall the fighter and send it tumbling from the sky. Modified fighters with upward-firing cannons, similar to the German Schrager music system, were tested. The idea was to approach the B-29 from below and behind, firing upward into the bomber's vulnerable belly. But Japanese factories struggled to produce sufficient quantities of these modified aircraft, and pilots required extensive training to employ the tactic effectively. By the time the modifications were widely implemented, American fighter escorts, P-51 Mustangs operating from Iwo Jima after its capture in February 1945, had arrived to protect the bombers. The capture of Iwo Jima represented another turning point in the air war over Japan. The tiny volcanic island, just 8 square miles of black sand and rock, lay approximately halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo. In American hands, it served two critical purposes. First, as an emergency landing field for damaged B-29s returning from Japan, and second, as a base for long-range escort fighters. The P-51 Mustang, fitted with external fuel tanks, could reach Tokyo from Iwo Jima and still have sufficient fuel for extended combat. The arrival of American fighter escorts eliminated whatever slim chance Japanese interceptors had of effectively engaging B-29 formations. Now, Japanese fighters attempting to climb to bomber altitude had to fight their way through swarms of P-51s, which operated at altitudes where they maintained full performance capability. The Mustangs could dive from above, make high-speed firing passes, and zoom back to altitude, while Japanese fighters labored in the thin air. It was a massacre. Japanese fighter losses mounted catastrophically through the spring of 1945. Captain Yasuhiko Kuroe, who survived the war as a fighter pilot with the 244th Sentai, later described the hopelessness of attempting to intercept B-29 formations. The Americans understood altitude advantage better than we did. Their fighters would orbit above the bomber stream waiting for us. We had to climb through them to reach the bombers. By the time we got to 25,000 feet, we were exhausted. Our aircraft were at the limit of performance, and the Mustangs would dive on us with tremendous speed. We could not maneuver effectively to evade. Many pilots simply turned back rather than continue climbing into certain death. The psychological toll on Japanese fighter pilots was immense. These were men who had trained for years, who had fought with distinction in China and throughout the Pacific, and who now found themselves technologically outmatched by an enemy whose industrial capacity seemed limitless. Every day brought new formations of B-29s, flying in neat ranks at altitudes Japanese fighters could barely reach, dropping tons of incendiaries and high explosives on Japanese cities. The pilots could see the bombers, could watch them destroying their homeland, but were powerless to stop them. Japanese losses in attempting to defend against B-29 raids were staggering. During the first 3 months of 1945, Japanese fighter units lost over 2,000 aircraft and 1,500 pilots in combat with B-29s and their escorts. These losses included some of Japan's most experienced pilots, men who had survived years of combat only to die trying to reach bombers that flew too high and too fast. The attrition was unsustainable. Training programs, already shortened by fuel shortages and lack of experienced instructors, produced replacement pilots with perhaps 50 hours of flight time, compared to several hundred hours for American pilots. These poorly trained replacements stood virtually no chance against experienced American fighter pilots flying superior aircraft. The ultimate irony of the altitude. Advantage became apparent when the strategic bombing campaign shifted tactics in March 1945. General Curtis LeMay, who had assumed command of the 20th Air Force, made a controversial decision. B-29s would abandon high-altitude precision bombing and instead conduct low-level incendiary raids at night against Japanese cities. The first such raid against Tokyo on the night of March 9th to 10th saw 334 B-29s attack from altitudes between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, well within range of Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft guns. The reason for this tactical shift had nothing to do with Japanese air defenses becoming more effective at high altitude. They hadn't. Rather, LeMay had concluded that precision bombing from 30,000 feet against Japanese industrial targets was ineffective. Cloud cover over Japan often obscured targets. The jet stream at high altitude, discovered by B-29 crews during their raids, created winds exceeding 200 miles per hour that scattered bomb patterns across miles. Bomb sites designed for European conditions were less accurate when bombing through clouds and high winds. Most critically, Japanese industry was dispersed throughout urban areas in small workshops and home-based production facilities, not concentrated in large factory complexes like those in Germany. Burning down entire cities was more effective than trying to hit individual factories. The low-level incendiary raids were devastatingly successful from a military standpoint. The Tokyo raid of March 9th killed an estimated 100,000 people, destroyed 16 square miles of the city, and gutted countless small industrial facilities. But Japanese air defenses were barely more effective at low altitude than they had been at high altitude. The B-29s attacked at night when Japanese night fighter capability was minimal. They came in waves that overwhelmed the limited number of searchlights and anti-aircraft batteries. And critically, they faced fighter pilots and anti-aircraft crews who had been trained and equipped to engage high-altitude targets, not low-level attackers at night. 14 B-29s were lost in the Tokyo raid, a loss rate of just over 4%. For the destruction inflicted, this was considered acceptable. Subsequent low-level incendiary raids against Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and other major cities produced similar results. Massive destruction, relatively low bomber losses. The Japanese air defense system, built around the assumption that bombers would attack at high altitude during daylight, proved ineffective against the new tactics. Yet the altitude advantage remained strategically important. When B-29s needed to conduct daylight precision strikes against specific targets, aircraft factories, oil refineries, chemical plants, or military installations, they returned to high-altitude tactics where Japanese fighters couldn't reach them. The flexibility to choose between high-altitude precision bombing and low-level area bombing, depending on the target and conditions, gave American planners options that Japanese defenders couldn't counter. Japanese technical efforts to develop an effective high-altitude interceptor continued throughout 1945, but they were hampered by material shortages, fuel scarcity, and the general collapse of Japanese industrial capacity under sustained bombing. The Mitsubishi J-2M Raiden, designed as a high-altitude interceptor, entered service in limited numbers, but suffered from chronic engine problems similar to those that plagued early B-29s. The Kawasaki Ki-100, developed by fitting a radial engine to the Ki-61 airframe, proved to be an excellent fighter, but arrived too late and in too few numbers to affect the strategic situation. By summer 1945, Japanese fighter defenses had essentially collapsed. Fuel shortages grounded most operational aircraft. Experienced pilots were dead or too exhausted to fly. Radar stations had been destroyed by bombing. Airfields were cratered and unusable. B-29s flew over Japanese cities with near impunity, mining harbors, bombing remaining industrial targets,
and maintaining relentless pressure on a nation already on the verge of surrender. The atomic bomb missions against Hiroshima on August 6th and Nagasaki on August 9th were flown at altitudes of approximately 31,000 feet, the same altitude Edmund Larsen had tested in March 1944. Japanese fighters scrambled to intercept both missions, but could not reach bombing altitude. The B-29 Enola Gay and Boxcar flew their missions without meaningful opposition, proving one final time that Japanese air defenses could not prevent American bombers from attacking any target in Japan. The test flights conducted in spring 1944 had revealed a fundamental truth. Altitude advantage was a form of technological supremacy that Japanese forces could not overcome with existing equipment and tactics. That advantage, combined with American industrial capacity that produced thousands of B-29s, millions of tons of bombs, and endless supplies of aviation fuel, rendered Japanese air defenses increasingly irrelevant as the war progressed. For Edmund Larsen, who had flown that first test mission in March 1944, the outcome was both validating and sobering. His flight had proven the concept, demonstrated that B-29s could operate beyond the reach of Japanese fighters. But validation came at a terrible cost. Over the next 17 months, B-29s would drop 167,000 tons of bombs on Japanese cities, killing hundreds of thousands of civilians and destroying much of Japan's urban infrastructure. The aircraft Larsen had tested became an instrument of strategic devastation on a scale previously unimaginable. Larsen himself flew 23 more combat missions over Japan before the war ended. He witnessed the destruction of
Tokyo, watched Japanese fighters make futile attempts to reach his altitude, and saw cities burn from 30,000 feet. After the war, he struggled with the moral complexity of what he had participated in. In a 1968 interview, he reflected, "We proved that the B-29 could fly higher than Japanese fighters could reach. That was our job, and we did it successfully. What happened next? The decision to burn Japanese cities, the scale of destruction. Those were decisions made by others. But I was part of the mechanism that made it possible. I don't know if what we did was right or wrong. I only know it was effective." The altitude advantage the B-29 possessed represented more than just superior engineering. It symbolized the fundamental imbalance in industrial and technological capacity between the United States and Japan. Where Japanese engineers were forced to make compromises due to limited materials and manufacturing capacity, American engineers could pursue complex, expensive solutions without the same constraints. The pressurization system alone required manufacturing precision that few nations could achieve. The Wright R-3350 engines, despite their problems, represented thousands of hours of development work by teams of engineers. The entire B-29 program consumed resources that exceeded Japan's entire aircraft production budget for the war. Japanese military planners had understood this disparity intellectually, but the test flights and subsequent combat operations forced them to confront it viscerally. They could design fighters theoretically capable of reaching 33,000 feet. They could not build those fighters in sufficient numbers, with sufficient performance margins, and supply them with sufficient fuel and pilots to mount an effective defense. Theory meant nothing when the engines choked out at 29,000 feet and the bombers flew serenely overhead at 31,000. Shall I continue with the final part of the script? The technical specifications told the story in stark numbers. A B-29 at combat weight, carrying 10,000 pounds of bombs and sufficient fuel for a 2,000-mile round trip, could maintain level flight at 31,000 feet while cruising at 220 miles per hour. A Nakajima Ki-44 Shoki at combat weight reached its service ceiling of approximately 29,000 feet after 18 to 20 minutes of climbing, arriving with barely enough fuel for 10 minutes of combat before having to descend. The performance gap of those 2,000 feet might as well have been 20,000. In aerial combat, altitude equals energy, and energy equals life. The B-29 crews had both. Japanese interceptor pilots had neither. The psychological impact of this helplessness extended beyond the pilots to Japanese civilians who watched the bombers pass overhead. In the early months of the war, Japanese propaganda had promised citizens that their skies were protected by invincible fighter pilots flying superior aircraft. The reality visible to anyone standing in Tokyo or Osaka or Nagoya told a different story. The bombers came in broad daylight, flying in precise formations, their contrails drawing white lines across the sky. Air raid sirens wailed, fighters scrambled, and the bombers continued unimpeded to their targets. Yukiko Tanaka, a schoolteacher in Tokyo who kept a diary throughout the war, recorded her observations in April 1945. Another raid today. We can see them clearly from the ground, tiny silver specks catching the sunlight. So high up they seem to move slowly, though I know they are traveling faster than any aircraft we possess. Our fighters climb to meet them, but they never get close. Sometimes we hear distant gunfire, but the bombers never seem to notice. They drop their bombs and turn for home, untouched. How can we win this war when we cannot even reach the enemy? This visible demonstration of American technological superiority undermined Japanese morale more effectively than any propaganda campaign could have. Citizens could see with their own eyes that their military could not protect them. The government's assurances of inevitable victory rang hollow when American bombers operated with apparent immunity over Japanese cities. The psychological warfare value of high-altitude bombing went beyond the physical destruction it caused. It demonstrated superiority in a way that was impossible to deny or explain away. Japanese technical journals from late 1944 and early 1945 show engineers desperately searching for solutions. Articles proposed exotic concepts: rocket-powered interceptors that could zoom to altitude in minutes, ramming aircraft designed to explode on contact with bombers, even proposals for crude surface-to-air missiles based on German designs. None of these concepts moved beyond the prototype stage. Japan's industrial base, strained by years of war and increasingly devastated by bombing, could barely produce conventional fighters. Exotic weapons programs requiring specialized materials and manufacturing techniques were impossible to implement at scale. Some Japanese engineers proposed accepting the altitude disadvantage and instead developing tactics to exploit the B-29's vulnerabilities. The aircraft's pressurization system, while revolutionary, was fragile. A single hit in the wrong location could explosively decompress the crew compartment. The remote-controlled gun turrets, while sophisticated, had blind spots that skilled pilots could exploit. The Wright R-3350 engines, notorious for catching fire, might be vulnerable to specific types of ammunition. These were valid observations, but they required getting close enough to the B-29 to exploit these weaknesses, and Japanese fighters could not consistently reach that position. The few Japanese pilots who did manage to engage B-29s at altitude reported a surreal, nightmarish combat environment. The thin air robbed aircraft of maneuverability. Control inputs that would produce sharp turns at lower altitude resulted in sluggish, wallowing responses at 30,000 feet. Engines ran rough, coughing and sputtering as they struggled to burn fuel with insufficient oxygen. Pilots reported feeling lightheaded and disoriented despite using oxygen masks, a result of the extreme altitude and physical exertion of combat. And the B-29s themselves, when engaged at close range, proved incredibly resilient. Their defensive armament was formidable: 10 50-caliber machine guns in remote-controlled turrets that could concentrate fire on attacking fighters. Multiple pilots reported hitting B-29s with cannon fire only to watch the bomber continue flying, its structure absorbing damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. First Lieutenant Isamu Sasaki, flying a Ka-84 Hayate, managed to reach 30,000 feet during a raid in June 1945 and engaged a B-29 formation. His after-action report, preserved in Japanese military archives, describes the encounter. I climbed for 17 minutes to reach their altitude. My aircraft was shaking, the engine running roughly. I approached from the rear quarter and fired a burst from approximately 200 meters. I observed hits on the bomber's left wing and fuselage. The bomber's guns returned fire immediately. I broke right and attempted to climb for another attack, but my aircraft would not respond. The controls felt like they were moving through mud. I had to descend to regain control. By the time I climbed back to altitude, the formation had passed, and I had insufficient fuel to pursue. Sasaki's experience was typical of the few Japanese pilots who successfully reached B-29 altitude. Even when they scored hits, even when they damaged individual bombers, they could not sustain attacks long enough to destroy their targets. The B-29's robust construction meant it could absorb significant damage and continue flying. Dozens of bombers returned to base in the Marianas with extensive battle damage, holes in wings, damaged engines, shattered gun turrets, but they returned. Japanese fighters, by contrast, were fragile by design. A few hits from defensive .50 caliber guns could shred thin aluminum skin and puncture unprotected fuel tanks. The strategic bombing campaign against Japan reached its crescendo in the summer of 1945. By July, most major Japanese cities had been extensively bombed. Industrial production had collapsed. Transportation networks were destroyed. Food distribution systems had broken down, and urban populations faced starvation. The mining of Japanese harbors and coastal waters by B-29s had strangled maritime trade. Japan still possessed millions of soldiers under arms, but they lacked the industrial support to sustain prolonged combat. The final irony of the altitude advantage was that it became less militarily necessary as Japanese resistance crumbled. By August 1945, B-29s could fly at any altitude with relative impunity. Japanese fighter strength had been so thoroughly attrited that even medium-altitude missions faced minimal opposition. Fuel shortages had grounded most of the surviving aircraft. Many airfields had been abandoned after repeated bombing. The elaborate air defense network constructed earlier in the war existed only on paper. Yet American planners continued to emphasize high-altitude operations when conducting precision strikes. Not because Japanese defenses required it, but because the altitude advantage had proven so overwhelmingly effective that there was no reason to abandon it. Why risk bombers at medium altitude when they could operate safely at 30,000 feet? The answer was self-evident. There was no reason. The test flights Edmund Larson and others conducted in spring 1944 had established a paradigm that governed American strategic bombing operations for the remainder of the war. Those flights proved that technological advantage, specifically altitude performance, could neutralize an entire nation's air defense system. The implications extended beyond World War II. Post-war bomber development focused heavily on altitude performance, leading to aircraft like the B-36 and eventually the B-52, both designed to fly higher than enemy interceptors could reach. The development of surface-to-air missiles in the 1950s and 60s was partially motivated by the recognition that piston-engine fighters could not reliably engage high-altitude bombers. For Japan, the inability to counter B-29s at altitude represented a fundamental failure of strategic planning and industrial capacity. Japanese military doctrine before the war had emphasized offensive operations, carrier strikes, ground campaigns, naval engagements in support of territorial expansion. Air defense of the home islands received comparatively little attention and fewer resources. When the strategic situation reversed, and Japan found itself on the defensive, the infrastructure and equipment needed for effective homeland defense did not exist and could not be rapidly created. The altitude gap also highlighted differences in how the two nations approached technological problems.
American engineers, supported by massive industrial capacity and nearly unlimited resources, could pursue complex, expensive solutions like cabin pressurization and turbo superchargers. They could test multiple approaches simultaneously and accept failures as part of the development process. The B-29 program itself experienced numerous setbacks, including fatal crashes during testing, before producing a combat-ready aircraft. Japanese engineers, working with limited resources and under intense time pressure, had to make compromises that optimized for immediate tactical needs rather than long-term strategic capabilities. Edmund Larson survived the war and remained in the Air Force, eventually retiring as a colonel in 1963. He never flew combat missions after World War II, but remained involved in bomber development programs, including early work on jet-powered strategic bombers. In his later years, he occasionally spoke to aviation historians about the test flights over the Pacific. He always emphasized the teamwork involved, the navigator, bombardier, gunners, and ground crews who made the missions possible, and downplayed his own role. But he acknowledged that proving the altitude advantage was operationally valid changed the course of the air war against Japan. "We weren't heroes," Larson said in a 1976 interview shortly before his death. "We were test pilots doing a job that needed to be done. But that job, proving that Japanese fighters couldn't reach us at 31,000 feet, that had consequences we couldn't have imagined. It meant thousands of B-29s could bomb Japan without the losses we'd seen in Europe. It meant we could maintain a strategic bombing campaign that Japan couldn't counter. And ultimately, it contributed to ending the war. Was it worth it? That's for historians to decide. I only know what we proved in March 1944. At 31,000 feet, we were beyond their reach." The bombers that flew at those altitudes dropped 167,000 tons of ordnance on Japan between November 1944 and August 1945. They destroyed 178 square miles of urban area across 67 cities. They killed between 300,000 and 900,000 civilians, depending on which estimates are used. They achieved strategic effects that contributed to Japan's decision to surrender, and they operated, for most of the campaign, at altitudes where Japanese fighters simply could not reach them. The test flights that proved this capability took a few hours each. The strategic consequences lasted 15 months and changed the war. One suicidal test flight over the Pacific in March 1944 revealed a gap in capability that Japan could not close, no matter how skilled their pilots or how desperate their tactics. At 31,000 feet, physics and engineering determined the outcome. Everything else was inevitable. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.